Well, today now we're going to talk about Burrhus Frederick Skinner, B.F. Skinner. Almost everybody who knows Skinner thinks of him as B.F. Skinner. Hardly anybody knows his first or middle name. But he is about as much a contrast as we could have from Henry Murray, whom we just talked about, and certainly from the psychoanalytic theorists. Skinner was a person who made the decision that the psychology should be a science. Therefore, anything that was not observable was not worth studying. Now, we've just finished spending a lot of time talking about, very complex concepts and, in fact, unique ways of looking at people, and we've given them unique names. Skinner, on the other hand, is someone who is going to try to talk about very, what we might think of as mundane behaviors. He will use some concepts we have to learn. In the concepts that Skinner uses that I think we haven't touched on before, I'll try to be repetitive. So in many respects, as we go on with this lecture, I mention things a couple of times so that in case you don't feel you understood it the first time, perhaps you'll pick up on it the second time. But, interestingly, Skinner gets studied in every personality theory textbook. And what's interesting is he doesn't have a theory of personality because Skinner doesn't believe in theory. This is a man who just talks about what you can observe, and he eliminates things like mind is irrelevant. What you think about is irrelevant. Your feelings as such, that is the internal experience you have in your feelings, is irrelevant. All he is interested in is what can you observe? And not only what you can observe, but what can you measure? And so as we go through, talking about him, what you want to keep in mind is that there are later theorists we're going to take who take some of his concepts and try to use them in a more complex way. That is, Skinner represents that movement in personality theory toward trying very hard to develop operational definitions, ones that perhaps everybody could agree on because everybody can observe the behavior that we're talking about. And he tries to make things as simple as possible by ruling out everything about you that could not be observed. And the effect that has, of course, is you really can't go very far in personality theory if you're not going to allow for an internal life. Now you'll see that his theory is called Operant Reinforcement Personality Theory. And of course it falls under the general heading of behaviorism. And as I've been saying, behaviorism stipulates that psychology is concerned with observable, measurable, operational behaviors. And when you think about it, when someone assumes you have no mind, which normally when someone says that to you, that's a pretty hostile statement to make to you, that I don't think you have any mind. But for Skinner, he felt as far as psychology is concerned, mind is irrelevant. It's really the flesh and blood that you can see in front of you and observe doing things that are important. So the idea that you might have a mind or you might have a soul, that you might have thoughts, that you might be reflective, in Skinner's theory, that's all irrelevant. And that's why, of course, so many people are aware of the fact that actually, if you rigidly follow Skinner, of course, you can't have a theory of personality. Now, his theory, though, operant reinforcement stipulates that the aims of psychology are the prediction and control of behavior. Now, there were some, when Skinner first started talking about this, that became very worried about him because this idea of controlling behavior, was seen as very negative. People didn't quite understand what he was talking about. Actually, Skinner was very altruistic in many ways. I mean, his idea of controlling behavior was to control bad behavior and to be able to reinforce good behavior so that people really could lead enjoyable lives. But most people didn't see it that way. And of course, when Skinner was teaching, as you can imagine, with university students, most university students are very involved in their inner life. So if they come into a psychology class and the person says, by the way, we have no interest in your inner life, for most students, that's a real turnoff. I mean, that's why they're there, is to develop more sensitivity to their inner life, to be made more aware of what their motives are, what their goals are, to learn more about how to be an intimate person, to be a self-fulfilled person, to overcome anxieties, etc. And here you have somebody coming in saying, oh, by the way, there is no such thing as anxiety. There is no such thing as depression. Those are feelings. We don't deal with them. What we want to be able to do is to observe you, and from those observations to be able to predict what you'll do, and through a series of reinforcements be able to control what you will do so that we will know that you're going to do this or that. Now, for Skinner, there were two classes of behavior: operant and respondent. Operant behavior, which is the larger class of behavior, is so designated because organisms operate on their environment. That is, people operate on their environment. And here we're talking about things like you eat, you walk, you talk, you kiss people, perhaps you hit people, but operant behaviors are very observable. They're what you do, and anybody can see you doing them. And what's important here is Skinner would say, it doesn't matter why you're doing it. So you're going for a walk. Are you going for a walk to get exercise? He doesn't care. Are you going for a walk because you're feeling frustrated and you just want to get away from things for a while? Are you going for a walk because you need to get someplace and get from here to there, you're going to walk? He would say the internal reasons are unimportant. He would say you can probably get to some of that by just observing the person's behavior. And then there's a smaller class of behavior, which he called respondent behavior. And this consists of very simple, unconditioned, and conditioned reflexes that we're going to talk about in a moment. Now, the theory of behavior modification is that it's a system of psychological treatment that derives much of its philosophical underpinnings from the work of Skinner. That is, behavior modification, which you have probably heard of, and if you haven't, you will when you take other courses, is really a system of treatment. And some of its principles actually come from Skinner, although the actual theory is far more complex than Skinner made it. Now, Skinner actually, was a person who, represented an extreme that allowed us to consider what happens in the science of psychology if you eliminate entirely someone's inner life. In behavior modification, that is in the system of treatment that we call behavior modification, one of the things that Skinner thought was important is that if he could observe maladaptive behaviors, and then he could develop ways to reinforce their opposite, then he could help people who were suffering to get into desired behaviors, and that would bring relief. The problem was that it was very hard to convince people that what they were experiencing internally was not something to be talked about. Now, Skinner also had a number of variables that he talked about. One is selective reinforcement. Selective reinforcement meant you watch behaviors and you choose to reinforce some of the behaviors but not others. The thesis being that if you reinforce the good behaviors and you don't reinforce the bad behaviors, the good behaviors will begin to dominate in the person's life. Also, he felt that through selective reinforcement, discriminations essential to personality development are learned. That is, you learn which behaviors are the ones that people like and will reward. You learn which behaviors are not liked. Perhaps people feel very negative about, and you won't get rewarded. Likewise, he thought that behavior could be altered by withdrawing reinforcement. That is, if you're doing something undesirable, but somehow you're getting a reward, then the way you want to stop that is stop giving the reward. And not giving the reward and having the behavior stop is something that Skinner called extinction. And extinction simply means that the reward for the behaviors becomes so weak you don't do it anymore. Now, Skinner did note that as he went along that not all prediction and control of behavior involves only positive reinforcement. He certainly saw that our environment contains many aversive stimuli which we try to escape from, or we at least try to avoid. We try to avoid loud noises. We try to avoid very bright lights. We try to avoid hostile people. Other aversive stimuli actually could involve the infliction of punishment or possibly the creation of anxiety. Skinner felt that the way to deal with behavior, by far, was to find positive behavior and reward it. And he thought that in the ultimate, if you could have people rewarded for all their good behavior, especially good behavior towards each other, you would really develop a culture that had real freedom and dignity. And as he went on, he more and more said that, punishment probably isn't very helpful as a motivator, and he became less and less interested in it. Now, an important positive aspect of Skinner, then, is that in his approach to personality, he insisted on the gathering of data. Very different from Henry Murray, who we were talking about. Henry Murray's data would be from one person. For Skinner, he wanted to take data from lots of people. And his method of operant reinforcement certainly is experimental in the extreme. It involves carefully controlling variables, and all the variables that are presented have to be quantifiable in some way. So you have to be able to show there is a way to measure whatever it is he's talking about. Thus, as I've already mentioned, introspection is gone. Introspection is irrelevant in this theory. And in fact, not only is introspection out, any mentalistic concept you can think of, you're not going to find in Skinner. And that's why lots of people don't find him very interesting. Now, traditionally, the behavioristic approach has been considered a form of S-R, that is, stimulus-response theory, in which the main events that we study are the responses an organism makes to stimuli that are in the external environment. So again, and I know I keep emphasizing this, he doesn't care if you're responding to something inside yourself. That's irrelevant to him. He's interested in what out there you're responding to. That is, what can we see in the environment that somehow is causing you to make a certain response. An important premise for Skinner is that behavior is considered lawful, and as such, it's subject to prediction and control. So he's saying that there are laws of behavior, and the purpose of his investigations is really to find out what are these laws of behavior. And he also thought that the way, to find these laws of behavior is through experimentation. Now, it's always been a contention among some observers of Skinner that his desire to predict and control behavior was so extreme that it really wasn't the science he claimed it to be. And these same people were the ones who worried about his theory being dangerous. That surprised him because he never thought of himself as in any way proposing something that was dangerous. He thought he was proposing something actually that was quite good. Now, Skinner would hold that an individual's personality is a product of his or her genetic endowment and his or her environmental situation. So genetics were important to him. And he would say that heredity does not cause behavior, but it does set limits on what you can do. And you'll see in a moment we talk about intelligence, for example. I mean, depending on how intelligent you are, that might set some limits on what one can do. He also said, genetics also set some limits because of your physical appearance, of the physical gifts that you have, and that all of those are relevant in the kind of behavior that you will engage in. Now, but for Skinner, it's the environment that is much more important because prediction and control are determined by understanding the environment that's out there and how you're responding to that environment. Skinner also would say that man is kind of master of his fate to some extent, and then he can manipulate external stimuli which control the environment. But if you were to say to Skinner, do people have free will? He would say, nonsense. Free will is irrelevant to science. We're not interested in free will. We're not going to study people from the perspective of are they reflecting and creating certain values and then making decisions are going to do this rather than that. That whole world that we think of so often, he's saying that's irrelevant. All we're interested in is what's out there in the environment and how do you respond to it. And if you're not responding the way you could in a productive way, how can we change that? Now Skinner's, started off, goes all the way back in the 1930s. And he began his efforts and his research really just trying to study learning. He really wasn't into personality. He was into learning. And he used white rats as his subjects. And he devised an apparatus that's called by many a Skinner box. Let's see if we can, I'll just have to push this up a bit. Okay. And he never wanted it to be called a Skinner box. He wanted it to be called an operant conditioning chamber. That was his very important thing to study. Now, in its original form, when he first did this, the chamber consisted of a small box, and it had this lever on the side. And he would put rats in the cage, and the rat would eventually find this lever. And the rat would just hit it because it's something to be hit. And then a pellet would come down of food. And the rat gradually began to learn every time you hit this lever, you get food. And it got to the point then where as long as the rat was hungry, the rat would keep hitting the lever, and the rat would only wait long enough to eat the pellet, hit it again, get another one, until there was some kind of satisfaction. Now then, in the 1940s, he was looking to get into somewhat more complex behavior, so he decided to study pigeons. So with the pigeons, he put a tiny disc on the side of the cage, and if the pigeon pecked the disc, then the pigeon got some grain. And so the pigeon eventually learned how to peck away and to receive this grain. And this allowed Skinner to see, like, and you'll see this in a moment, to develop certain kinds of schedules to predict behavior in both the rats and later on in the pigeons. But later in his career, actually, Skinner wanted to apply learning, to people, especially to children. And his thesis was that learning takes place best if it's in very small segments and that you reward people for all of their learning. So if someone is studying some subject, you want to build in a reward system. It could be a verbal reward, good, nice job, or it could even be food. And in some of Skinner's work, he became famous, and his followers for using M&Ms. You do something right, you get an M&M. You don't do it right, you get nothing. You quickly learn that what you just did that you thought was right isn't right because you didn't get the M&M. Or you didn't get someone saying, nice job. And Skinner actually took this to, somewhat of an extreme for him. For us, actually, probably wasn't an extreme for him. But he wrote a book called Walden 2. And in Walden 2, he tells us how life could be perfect if everything was reinforced positively, and if your life was such that you got positive reinforcements for everything, and that would cause you to behave in certain ways that would make life for the rest of us very nice. Now, as I've said, Skinner's first aim was the prediction and control of behavior. And it was because of this that people got interested in him, because people thought, this is what science is about. I mean, in science, so often, we do want to be able to predict. We do want to be able to control certain things. We want to know if we do A, that B will occur. And we want to know how to make B to occur. And we want to know what elements of A are necessary in order for B to happen. And that can be, at the very, basic elements at the biochemical level. Skinner wanted to do that, of course, at the behavioral level. And as I've mentioned, Skinner thought that behavior actually, could be reduced to these two simple things. It could be either operant or it can be respondent. And he used as a paradigm for him some of the research that had been done by Pavlov, which I assume you're familiar with. Pavlov did these very simple conditioning, and Skinner felt that if you used the kind of reinforcers that Pavlov talked about, some of which were conditional, some of which were unconditional, and they're paired, that you can actually get people to begin to react to the conditioned stimulus as if it were the unconditioned one. Now, for the most part, Skinner felt that personality is acquired and maintained through the use of positive and negative reinforcers. Personality for him really wasn't a thing. It would be more accurate to say for him, behaviors were acquired through the use of positive and negative reinforcers. And within this system of reinforcers, he said that a behavior is strengthened, or the probability of its occurrence is increased, when reinforcement is applied. Pretty simple statement. And in his early studies, Skinner found that when a rat was placed in an operant conditioning chamber, it would press the lever, depending on whether it needed rewards or not. And these pellets that came out became the measurement for him about whether the rat was hungry, whether the rat had learned or not, how to take care of itself. And so he posited that there were certain things that were primary reinforcers. And things were primary reinforcers because you didn't need to think about them in order to seek them. That is, biologically, you would seek certain things. So primary reinforcers became things like food, like drink. He included sex. But they were acts that just naturally people sought. Now, secondary reinforcers then, which were the other kind of reinforcers, referred to stimuli that developed the characteristics of primary reinforcers. So primary reinforcers were saying things like food. What would be a secondary reinforcer? What would be something you think that would remind you of food, might cause you to act the same way? Let's say you're hungry.
A commercial?
Commercial for food, that's a good one, yes. How about even more concretely? You're out, you're driving around, you're hungry.
Smell.
Okay, smell of a restaurant, yes. But before that, like seeing a McDonald's sign. That could be your secondary reinforcer. That is, you see them, you're hungry, you see the McDonald's sign. Do you think McDonald's sign? No. What you think is food. I will not be hungry if I just get to the sign. So it takes on all kinds of meaning. I mean, in itself, it's just a piece of metal and some color. But in reality, it takes on all these meanings. What's interesting, of course, is that in order for that to happen, you have to be doing something cognitive. And you have to recall now that for Skinner, he could care less about the fact that there was a cognitive act. See, he wouldn't be interested in your saying, that's a McDonald's sign, and therefore there's food there. What he would observe is, and he would say what's important to psychology is, watch her. She's hungry. She sees the McDonald's sign. She drives to McDonald's. That's all he was studying. He would not pay any attention to the fact that she actually reflected on the idea, McDonald's is where there's food. He would say that's not what psychology is about. Psychology is not interested in that reflection. Psychology is interested in saying, every time we see her, and she's in her car, and she's hungry, and she sees a McDonald's sign or some other sign, she drives to that place. That's what he was interested in. Now, in addition to these primary reinforcers then, there's also conditioned positive reinforcers, which keep us going or help us to acquire behaviors that do not have especially biological significance. Such reinforcers, for instance, might be money. You know, after all, money it's only paper. Diplomas, prizes, or the behavior other people give us, like other people praise us, say nice things to us, show attention to us. These are conditioned reinforcers. That is, in and of themselves, they don't satisfy thirst or hunger or sex, but what they do satisfy are basic needs in us, and we seek them because they do things for us that we want done, and they're measurable. You can look at them, you can observe them. Then, now Skinner did say that negative reinforcers also will influence behavior, and they can strengthen behavior. And a negative reinforcer is designated as a stimulus which strengthens behavior when the stimulus is removed, just as positive reinforcers strengthen behavior when they're presented. And negative reinforcers can be either primary or they can be conditioned. Now, primary negative reinforcers might include things like, say, putting on dark glasses to escape the glare of the sun, opening an umbrella because it begins to rain, turning up the heat because you're feeling cold, or turning on the air conditioning, obviously, if the opposite is occurring. Now, the removal of the aversive stimulus strengthens behavior. So when you think about it, you are very hot, you turn on the air conditioning, the heat goes away. Now, with regard to conditioned negative reinforcers, examples might be we walk away from people because they're obnoxious or they annoy us. Or a conditioned negative reinforcer might be you're whizzing along the street, you see a police car. Immediately you slow down. You're not slowing down because you want to slow down. You're slowing down because you want to avoid getting a ticket. So the reinforcer for you is a negative one. It is to avoid something unpleasant. It is not to achieve something pleasant. Skinner actually felt that one of the sad things in life is that way too much of our behavior is controlled by negative reinforcement. He noted for things like insurance companies, for example, at least until lately, did not reward us for driving safely. It used to be you paid a premium and you kept paying the premium until you get in an accident. Then you got punished and you paid a higher premium. But nobody paid attention to the fact you've been driving for 15 years and you've never had an accident. Perhaps you are very low risk. Perhaps we should reduce what you have to pay, like reward you for your behavior. Skinner felt that idea of rewarding somebody was very important and that many corporations miss that. He also felt there were other things in life that we do, sometimes painfully, because we want to avoid the consequences. For example, no one really wants to pay taxes. Or at least there are very few people that I know of who want to pay taxes. But you pay taxes, sometimes very hefty taxes, because you don't want to end up in prison. And also, being part of society, you have agreed to do it. But it's a very powerful negative reinforcer that if you don't pay your taxes, you're probably going to end up in prison. Now, the next tenet then that Skinner came up with is that behavior can be altered if you weaken or withhold reinforcements. For example, if one does an unpleasant job for a salary, if the person stops getting paid, they stop working. I mean, it's very clear. If you don't get reinforced, you will not do this behavior. Or, if you start a course, you take a course here, you get into the course for a while, this course is as dull as the dullest course you've ever taken. I mean, and you took it because you thought it was required. And suddenly someone says, this is not a required course. You say it's not. You drop it right away. I mean, who wants to waste their time on this? So there are things that you do only because you're required to do. You do things that behaviorally you do not wish to do, but the negative consequences are such that you feel you have to go on with it. Now, the process where the behavior is determined by reinforcement and ends if the reinforcement is not present is what we called before extinction. That is, there's a behavior that is out there, there's a demand. You continue to do this thing because there are negative consequences. You take away those negative consequences, boy, the behavior disappears. Now, it's also important to understand that, extinction actually can be a powerful component in shaping behavior. For example, if a child continuously gets attention by having a tantrum, the child often continues to have tantrums. If the parents can tolerate letting the child have the tantrum for a while and paying no attention to the child suddenly learns that, having a tantrum doesn't get attention. Now, if the child finds out that doing something else gets attention, the child may move then to more appropriate behavior. So the parents feel better, the child feels better. What Skinner would say is what actually happened, if you watch this interpersonal interaction, child does an observable thing, yells and screams. Parents do something observable. They run and hold the child, reinforce the child. Therefore, the child, every time he or she wants to be held, screams and yells. Now we watch the parents. They don't run. Child screams more. Child is driving everybody batty, but parents don't go. Child stops screaming. Now if the child is tired and is just sitting there kind of cooing, and parents go over and pick them up, the child realizes, gee, when I'm in this, I'm this way, I can get attention. Or if I do something else that attracts the parents, I can get attention. And what Skinner would say is that extinction is very important. You got rid of a highly undesirable behavior, and you've replaced it with a behavior that everybody else likes a lot more.
Sir,
Sure.
I have a question that I know is not really relevant to this class, but at what age is a child before they can understand that concept? That if they stop a behavior, that they can be rewarded for it,
Oh, very early, because the child needs to be able to make some distinctions. For instance, the child does need to be able to know if there is a mom out there, or a dad, or somebody, whoever responds. So the child has to have gotten to the point where they recognize, they've differentiated that I'm not the only one in the world. So let's say they're not 2 or 3 months old because they haven't made that distinction yet. But once the child makes the differentiation that there's me and there are other people, then the child starts making the differentiation. When I do certain things, those people react. And certainly that takes place probably in the second half of the first year of life. So you're right. In the beginning, if you were to do that right after the child is born, the child might not be learning much. But once the child is able to recognize there are other stimuli besides me the child, then this thing works. Now, in terms of this theory then, or in terms of what Skinner talked about, it becomes very important that one understands discrimination. In fact, discrimination is very important to personality development because you have to be able to recognize that there are various choices out there. Now, in early learning, for example, generalization is very important. If we take the baby that you just mentioned, in the beginning of life, the baby might respond that everybody's mom. I mean, it doesn't really matter as long as I yell or scream, somebody comes and picks me up. Whoever it is makes me feel good, but I don't really know that this is mommy. Later, the child understands that person who comes and picks me up is mommy. I mean, I can identify her. So then learning is taking place. Mommy has become specific, and thus there's a discrimination on the part of the child in understanding who really is the caregiver. That also allows, of course, the child then to discriminate that there are other people out there, perhaps who do other things for me, or there are other people who can do the same thing for me that mommy does. So this concept of being able to discriminate and then being able to generalize was very important to Skinner's theory. And of course, these are things that can be learned, and that, of course, is very important to his theory. Also, he pointed out that even in your everyday life, discrimination really matters. For instance, let's say you go to a party, and you know enough about yourself to know you could have a couple cocktails, and actually, you're okay. But if you take a third cocktail, you absolutely should not drive. That you're dangerous if you. Well, that's a terribly important discrimination to know that if you had 1 drink or 2 drinks or whatever, you're okay. You're still very alert. You don't seem to have problems doing something. But if you go over that threshold, you have really become a serious threat to others. Well, for our society, of course, for all of us, that's very important. Now, next then, Skinner talked about variability of responding. And he felt that personality becomes shaped or differentiated depending on how well we actually learn this concept of variability. And he felt it's important to understand that there is stimulus discrimination and there's response differentiation. Now, in simple terms, like learning to walk and to talk or to perform simpler complex motor tasks would be response differentiation. Then he noted, as life becomes more complex, let's say such as developing athletic abilities or maybe developing musical abilities, we have a long process of differentiation. I mean, if you think about it in athletics, if you think about learning golf, you think about how many different things there are to learn. I mean, you have to learn to drive, you have to learn to hit iron shots, you have to learn to chip, you have to learn to putt. These are all differentiated kinds of behaviors. That is, some people drive very well, they putt very poorly. So the fact that you do one well doesn't all mean that you'll do the other. And once you've differentiated these pieces, then you can change your behavior. The same thing if you're learning to, say, play the trumpet. That's a very complex kind of thing to do. And there are very fine discriminations that are necessary in learning to play. Now, Skinner's theory would be you need to break down all those components. Because if you break down all the components there are in learning to play the trumpet, and then you can teach someone each of those components, the person should be able to play the trumpet. Now, there really is something to this theory in that if you accurately break down the differentiated components and there's a way to teach them, then the person should be able to learn to play the instrument. In fact, for those of you who are in music, I'm sure you've seen this. That is, you see someone who actually plays the instrument rather well. They've been taught all the right things to do. Now, what some of us would say, but the person has no soul. I mean, they play the music, but there's no feeling to it. They don't seem to have a feeling. In fact, you ever watch sometimes, if you watch an orchestra and you pick out somebody, who's there, they're playing away, and you're looking at them and you're saying, this person is 100 miles away from here. I mean, there's nothing about them that strikes you that they're really into it, versus the person who is playing music and you just feel they're incredibly in tune with what they're doing. Now, for Skinner, as I've been saying repetitively, it wouldn't matter whether you had soul or not. That is, that's not a scientific concept. You can't work with that. So what Skinner would say, what's important is find out about all the various things there are in learning how to play the trumpet, teach each of those skills, and the person will play the trumpet. And that's as far as we can go scientifically. Skinner also thought, by the way, that a lot of our behavior is developed through modeling. And when we talk about Albert Bandura's theory shortly, you'll see modeling played a very important concept for him. But what Skinner's concept of modeling means, you watch others, and you see that others do certain things successfully, so you do them that way. And Skinner, by the way, would say that besides primary reinforcement, which we've been talking about, if he were to allow for personality, he would say that personality is probably maintained by a series of conditioned reinforcements. And such reinforcers, for example, may be neutral in themselves. They may have next to no meaning, but they take on meaning to you. And the one that's easiest to use in this, of course, is money. In itself, I mean, it's only paper. So, and often, you sometimes think about that. I mean, money in itself is not valuable. But what money can allow you to do becomes tremendously valuable. So the conditioned reinforcer, money, allows you to do other things like eat and drink, which are primary reinforcers, that you might not be able to do without them. Also, we learned that there are certain behaviors that are maintained by reinforcers, whether they're delivered, whether the reinforcer is regular or whether it's just intermittent. For example, a basketball player who keeps making her shots will probably keep shooting. She's constantly getting reinforced. However, as she begins to miss, especially if she misses a lot of shots in a row, she'll probably stop shooting so much. So the behavior that once was rewarding and that was very repetitive begins to get extinguished because there's no reward. Now we're going to talk about different kinds of reinforcers. And reinforcers actually are a complex process, by the way, and they can be divided into what are called scheduled reinforcements. And really there are four basic ones. There's fixed interval reinforcements, there's variable interval reinforcements, there are fixed ratio, and there are variable ratio reinforcements. In fixed interval schedules, reinforcement is delivered on a regular time basis. For example, you have a job, you're paid by the hour or you're paid by the week. Very predictable. You know, I work this week, at the end of the week, I always get a check. In variable interview schedules, reinforcement is based on a time schedule, which varies, but it averages out to a specific time. For example, our social life kind of operates this way. You don't get invited to the same number of parties every week, but you may get a lot of invitations one week. You may go for a period without getting invitations. Then you get invitations again. But the fact is that invitations are reinforcing to you that you have a social life. You cannot predict precisely when you're going to get them, but you could predict in a broader sense of, like, in the next 3 months, I expect to get X number of invitations. Then there are fixed ratio schedules. And these are delivered on the basis of how many response an individual makes, regardless of time. So supposing, for example, you're working selling a product. We'll say you're selling cars. And you're paid on the basis of cars that you sell. So the reinforcement is not every Friday you get a check because you work 40 hours. The reinforcer is you make money when you sell a car. And that particular phenomena may not be predictable. But what is predictable, if you're good at it, is that you will sell some cars, and you know that, and you will get rewarded, but you can't predict precisely when. Now, the fourth reinforcer is variable ratio schedule. And this is where the reinforcement is delivered irregularly, but it averages out to a given figure. The most famous of these, of course, are slot machines, where you don't know when they're going to hit. But if they hit just enough times, they keep you involved in the activity. Even though you know in the long run you will lose. I mean, anybody who has read any book about gambling knows if you use slot machines for a long time, you do any kind of gambling, you will lose. But if you go in and the first time you pull the lever, you get a reward, you engage in that behavior and you keep thinking things will get better. Now, these really are the basics of Skinner. His theory is not really very important for our purposes, but you're going to see shortly, as we talk about other theorists, that these concepts come up over and over again. And so you want to be able to recognize what we're talking about. And you'll also see significant improvements in these concepts when we talk about other theorists.